Welcome to her remarkable history. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The horrific afterlife of Catherine of Valois, a queen left unburied for 400 years. Now, Catherine Valois was born on the 27th of October 1401 to Charles VI of France. Catherine's first husband was King of England, Henry V, but it was her second husband which would create a new dynasty. Now, Catherine married a man called Owain ap Mordrate ap Tudor, or, as we know him today, Owen Tudor. Owen and Catherine would fall in love, and their marriage would be scandalous. But their sons would create the line of Tudor kings that would rule England for nearly 150 years. But Catherine, although the mother of the dynasty, would be disgraced after her death, and her descendants would ignore the situation. Now, the actual cause of Catherine's death is uncertain. She had previously given birth, but some records indicate she had health issues for some time, and that is why she sought treatment of prayers at Bermondsey Abbey. Catherine was only 35 years old when she passed away on the 3rd of January 1437. Although Catherine had remarried Owen Tudor, when she died she was given the funeral fit for a queen. It is thought that she was embalmed shortly after her death, as was common practice at the time, and her body would then be wrapped inside a cloth and encased in a sheet of lead. Catherine would then be placed into a wooden coffin. During the embalming process, Catherine's organs would have been removed, and these were placed into jars or boxes and buried in separate locations, and it is thought that some of Catherine's organs would have been buried in the churches along the route of her funeral procession. But there is no documented proof to say that Catherine's organs were found at any documented stop. Catherine did, however, have a funeral at St. Catherine's, the church of her patron saint, before being moved towards her final destination. Now, on top of Catherine's coffin was an effigy, and it was dressed in Catherine's own clothing. Interestingly, her effigy was carved of wood, and you can still see this today if you visit Westminster Abbey. Her effigy was painted in realistic colours, with a long neck and a charming tilt to the head. Ideally, effigies were intended to look as much as like the deceased as possible. So if Catherine's effigy is following this tradition, she was a tall, willowy figure. There are clues to say that her effigy once had a wig attached to its head, according to the painted surface of the scalp, and that her eyes were bluey-grey. But the effigy now only wears a painted red shift, but during the funeral it wore a purple satin mantle. Catherine's coffin itself was covered in cloth of gold, perched atop a huge hearse. Then, on February the 8th, 1437, Catherine had her second funeral service, and was laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, near to her first husband, Henry V. Now, for most people, their story would end at the place of their burial. But for poor Catherine, this was just not the case. Some historians believe that perhaps Catherine's tomb was intended to be temporary, with her son, Henry VI, wanting to devise a more appropriate memorial for her. But unfortunately, Henry died before he could decide what to do in her memory. Catherine's grandson was Henry VII, and he decided to demolish the old Lady Chapel where Catherine was buried and to build a new one. So unfortunately, Catherine's tomb was destroyed in the process, and unearthing her body as they were digging for new foundations. Catherine's coffin, that was made of wood, was found to be badly decayed, and so the decision was made to take her remains out of it. Her body was put into a wooden chest lined with flat sheets of lead cut from the roof of the old chapel. Catherine, now laying in a chest, was placed onto the floor near to her husband's tomb, and it was here that she would remain for another 300 years. An interesting concept, believed by some, is that the reason Henry VII ordered the tomb's deliberate destruction was that he wanted to distance himself from his ancestry. But in his will he did mention that Catherine was someone he wanted to be buried with. In our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and specifically the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to Henry V, our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, and that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried. It is believed that Henry VII saw the Lady Chapel as the Tudor family tomb. But just like Catherine's son, Henry VII died before the chapel could be completed, and then his son, Henry VIII, never carried out his last requests, nor did Henry VIII bury his great-grandmother, as did none of the Tudors that came after him. It is believed that the chest that Catherine now found herself in had a lid that split into sections, and it's believed through accounts that this lid was opened to display her remains from the waist up whenever visitors wanted to see her. A sad thing is that one individual even stripped back the cerecloth from Catherine's face and chest and legs, and found that her body, although desiccated, was somewhat intact, the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather. It is thought that perhaps because people described Catherine's flesh and skin with no clothing over it, that perhaps she was buried naked in her shroud. Another sad fact is that the Abbey tour guides would charge £1 for visitors to get a peek at Catherine's remains, and her body became a popular tourist attraction for around 300 years. There are legends as to why Catherine ended up the way that she did, and some believe it's because she went against her husband's orders to not give birth to Henry VI at Windsor. There is a prophecy believed by Henry V stating that a prince born at Windsor would lose everything his father had gained, so Henry ordered Catherine not to give birth there, but Catherine didn't listen. Sensible of her fault in disobeying her husband, it was her own desire and pleasure that her body should never be buried. If so, it is pity but that woman, especially a queen, should have her will therein, whose dust doth preach a sermon of duty to femmen, and of morality to all beholders. It's believed that this legend reflects early judgment that Catherine couldn't contain her love and lust for Owen Tudor, and therefore she ended up as a person who became a morbid curiosity through her own so-called bad behaviour. Now, one famous writer, Samuel Pepys, described what he saw when he made a visit to the Abbey and saw Catherine's body. He had previously been to see Shakespeare's production of Henry V and thought this may have spurred his curiosity to see the real Catherine who had been wooed by a king. On Shrove Tuesday 1669 I went to the Abbey, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, and I 36-year-old, and I did kiss a queen. There are even talks of a tradition that arose where individuals would kiss Catherine's corpse, and this is referenced by Shakespeare in the play, with several kisses for the queen, who had witchcraft in her lips. But if the last 300 years had not been enough, when the 18th century passed, the mistreatment of Catherine's body escalated. In 1786, Richard Gough wrote that in recent years the young scholars at Westminster had amused themselves with tearing it to pieces, and then when Gough himself saw it, he reported the condition of Catherine's body as being a shapeless mass of whitish colour. It was then, in 1788, when the situation finally came to a close, and Catherine's remains were put into the Villiers vault, where it was only opened to admit the recently deceased Countess of Buckingham. Catherine's body there lay undisturbed for almost 100 years, and the memory of her began to fade, with the location being half forgotten, when Dean Stanley, who restored the monuments in the abbey, began to search for Catherine in the records. In the December of 1877, Lord Percy died and his family tomb was opened to admit his body. The Villiers vault, where Catherine lay, was adjacent, and with permission of Queen Victoria, Dean Stanley's assistants waited until the evening until after the funeral, and then went into the Percy vault, where they broke through the thin wall that separated the vaults to see if Catherine really lay in the Villiers vault, and if so, to retrieve her. Stanley's team found her remains on top of a pile of coffins beneath the Countess's effigy. The pile had tilted over, and Catherine's coffin had fallen against a damp wall, and where the wall touched the coffin, it had rotted into a soft, pulpy mush. When they tried to lift Catherine's coffin, it stuck to the coffin below. They managed to free it and slid a solid plank of wood beneath, and shored up the pulpy side so that they could move it. After a lot of effort of shifting around in the small space, they managed to work the coffin free and therefore lift it out of the vault. But the change in humidity had an immediate effect, and within a few hours the coffin had fallen into fragments. Sadly, several portions of Catherine's body were found to be missing as previously described. It appeared to the examiners that the remains had been doused with lime, and several portions had been eaten away by it, but they may have misinterpreted the damage that they saw. The entire front portion of Catherine's skull was gone, and one piece of the back of it was found lying by her pelvis. Most of her vertebrae was missing as well, and all of her ribs, except for one, were missing. 2 of her right arm bones were also gone. Though the team searched, they did not find a single one of her teeth. 1 finger bone had gone and had been replaced with a pelvic bone, and it is believed that Catherine's bones and teeth were taken by visitors as souvenirs over the centuries. Unfortunately for Catherine, it was at this point that there was some more damage, albeit accidental, because her bones were so fragile from the dampness of the atmosphere. They turned to powder when touched, like wet sand, but as they dried they then hardened. Catherine's legs, however, were found to be still encased in about 12 layers of cerecloth and in perfect condition. It is believed that the team reported her skin was still remaining on her right arm, and it was smoothed out as she dried, and her legs still appeared to be supple. Beneath Catherine's head were sheets of cerecloth, and the remains of a wool pillow still retaining a few fragments of the silk which had once covered it, and it's then believed that Queen Victoria was presented with one of these shreds. Catherine's body was then taken to be placed beside Henry V in his chapel. It was a striking and impressive scene which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without feeling some of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works. The latter, carrying in his hand 1 small lantern to light us, led the way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, "We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral." Not a word was said as we passed slowly around the ambulatory in the darkness. Catherine's body was then placed into a new coffin which was made of English oak, and they also placed the pieces of the old chest inside of the new one, along with an inscription plate explaining the journey her body had taken over the last 100 years. Lifting the altar slab, they built a new tomb beneath it, and used a slab of grey marble slate for her coffin to rest on. Catherine of Valois finally had the tomb fit for a queen 400 years after her death. There is a Latin inscription which reads, under this slab, once the altar of this chapel, for long cast down and broken up by fire, rest at last, after various vicissitudes, finally deposited here by command of Queen Victoria, the bones of Catherine de Valois, daughter of Charles VI, King of France, wife of Henry V and mother of Henry VI, grandmother of Henry VII, born 1400, crowned 1421, died 1438. Now we know that her date of birth is off by 1 year, as is the date of her death, as Catherine was born on October 27, 1401, and died on January 3rd, 1437. The report that talks of her interment at the Abbey comes to a close with these lines: "It is the latest royal tomb in the Abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should at length be brought to an honourable end. Resequit in pace." Thank you so much for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.